think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
In this episode, I want to talk about something which my spirits warn me against as being something very mentally dangerous. A danger which our culture is not only ignorant about, but actually tends to embrace. That psychological menace is nostalgia. Our current culture, especially the fastidious and dogmatic realms of fandom or so-called nerd culture, is absolutely obsessed with celebrating and even deifying the past. While it seems harmless to do what merely appears to be an appreciation of the past, my spirit contacts say that our culture is entirely ignorant to the spiritual danger of nostalgia. On a physical surface level, it warps people's perceptions of art and entertainment. People often venerate old movies, TV shows, books, or video games far beyond their actual worth. I'm not saying that all of the classics aren't good, certainly many of them are, but our culture is very much caught in an Emperor's New Clothes scenario, viciously defending and glorifying certain things simply because everyone else does. When long-running properties, for instance Star Wars, Alien, Star Trek, and the like, have new current releases, fans are often all too ready to attack them with what can only be called furious vitriol, while, at the same time, uncritically venerating the old releases, not holding them up to the same scrutiny, let alone the same entitled contempt. This is often nostalgia's fault. It is also the fault of nostalgia when someone stubbornly refuses to acknowledge any new music and dogmatically and spitefully dismisses and attacks anything that has come out since they were young. Nostalgia is also harmful in a more subtle spiritual way. We are meant to be ongoing, constantly evolving beings who continue to change and mature even after physical death. We are not meant to be stuck in the ruts and grooves of the past, no matter how comfortable or safe they may seem. Someone who allows themselves to be enslaved by nostalgia is preventing themselves from spiritually evolving. Try new things, be it food, music, literature, video games, whatever. Letting go of the security blanket known as nostalgia will only help you psychologically, experientially, and spiritually. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
Farmers in the Philippines are reporting continuous vicious attacks on animals living in their farms. The attacks, caused by an unknown creature, reportedly happened between midnight and 2 a.m. and right before the arrival of the full moon. Mayor Lemuel Cipriano says the mysterious animal has already killed 200 goats by sucking their blood. The carcasses are then thrown out in the open field, showing signs of strangling and stomach wounds. It's a continuing goat massacre happening at the onset of the full moon almost every year since 2012. So far, more than 200 goats had been massacred by this unknown killer, Cipriano told the Manila Standard today. The locals, who are sure the attacks are being caused by a four-legged werewolf, are afraid they could be next after the goat population is wiped out. The goat population in the island was estimated at 1,000 before the killing spree began. We cannot determine yet if the killers are werewolves, dogs, or creatures pretending to be dogs, municipal agriculturist Nelia Yap said. The incidents are strikingly similar to those made known by the infamous chupacabras in the 1990s. The mayor has decided to keep police night patrols active in the area in an attempt to stop the slaughter. It is undetermined whether the attacks are being carried out by one or more creatures traveling in packs across the island. It was a terrible fall for the residents of Bluffton, Ohio. Reports of a nocturnal animal that cried like a baby and screamed like a woman emanated out of local coon hunters. There is not much information regarding this case except for a short article that was published on the front page of a local newspaper. Even though this creature's screams had been reported years earlier, the real trouble began in 1952 when it started killing dogs. First, it sounded like the low cry of a human baby, the Yocums told Bluffton News in November of 1956. The Yocums had been hunting in the old Perry Bechtold Woods, 3 miles northeast of Lafayette, when their coonhound approached the eerie sound. Seconds later, the dog came back to its owners with its tail between its legs. But that wasn't the first time that the Yocum family had experienced an encounter with the beast. In 1952, one of their children and a friend were hunting when the same blood-curdling sound suddenly erupted. Their dog tried to catch the animal, but by the time the boys had reached the spot of the incident, the canine was laying dead with a broken neck. Other deaths soon followed, and the community weren't able to figure out who the culprit was, prompting authorities to organize hunting parties that soon turned out to be unsuccessful. What was this mysterious animal, which was capable of producing such sounds and also strong enough to break a dog's back? A mountain lion? A bear, perhaps? Raccoons are known for the peculiar sounds they emit at night, and although they are equipped with the necessary tools to defend themselves from unnecessary dog attacks, especially when they are in groups, this doesn't explain the acute trauma applied on the canine's back. Were these primate vocalizations similar to those reported in Bigfoot encounters? It is not easy for people to share their close encounters with a cryptid, probably for fears of being ridiculed in today's society. The very few who have had the privilege to meet the beast personally tend to keep these stories secret. And when they finally open themselves to the world, these type of accounts sound so incredible and outlandish the majority of readers laugh in mocking disbelief. Connie Berg Mueller waited until 2004 to tell her amazing story. She lived in Idaho during the 1940s, and her father owned a ranch in Idaho County next to the Salmon River, also known as the River of No Return. They would visit this place every week to take care of some animals. While business was being taken care of by the men, I was very bored. I would explore the ranch area all day, she told Fate magazine. I found a place on the ranch where a spring ran through. The trees were tall and there was a lot of brush. It was my little haven and secret place. Reportedly, one day she heard a noise coming out of a bush next to her favorite spot. At that moment, a huge creature approached the young girl. It was about 8 feet tall with stringy white hair, a little darker on the more exposed areas. It had a flat face with dark squinted eyes. At first I was frightened, thinking it was a bear. As the creature came closer, I felt it was trying to calm and reassure me that I was not in any danger, Bergmuller recalls. This animal, she believes, appeared to be a female acting like a mother. They sat together and communicated. I felt comfortable with her. We sat on a log and she held my hand, placing her gentle hand on my knee. I talked to her and she responded with low, deep tones and nods of understanding. To her surprise, 30 minutes later, another creature showed up, but this one seemed upset. Its eyes burned black and larger. As the new guest approached them, she figured it was a male, possibly the other individual's mate. The female Bigfoot stood up, sneering at him and putting him in his place. Every time they visited the ranch, she would go to her secret place and meet the unusual couple, and one day, she said, she was surprised by a new member. Once the female brought a young creature there for me to meet. I felt it must have been an offspring of hers. According to Bergmuller, the male Bigfoot always showed signs of anger, trying to show that he was tough and in charge, but the female always kept him under control, and made him act more gently toward her. After selling the ranch in the 1950s, she never went back. I never did have a chance to say goodbye to my friends, which I would love to have done. I told my mother about my friends, but she did not believe a word of my story. She marveled at my imagination, but suggested I stop making up stories like that. I never mentioned the subject again, she said. I had never heard of Bigfoot or Yeti as a child, but now I know who my friends were. They will always be a part of my childhood and remember dearly. They were not the imagination of a child because I talked and visited with them on a regular basis. On October 15th, 1954, at 0340 hours, in St. Pierre-Halt, France, a baker saw a brilliant yellow craft descend rapidly and land on the railroad tracks. It was shaped like a mushroom, about 4 meters diameter, 2 meters high. On October 15th, 1954, at 1300 hours, in Luino, Italy, an ovoid object made a pass over a range of trees. 2 caught fire. On October 15th, 1954, in the afternoon, in Pol di Noca, Italy, farmers saw a disc-shaped object land, then take off vertically. At the site was found a deep crater about 6 meters in diameter. Poplar trees were partially burned. Official investigation. On October 15th, 1954, at 1950 hours, in Nîmes-Corbasec airfield, France, a yellow, cigar-shaped object with brilliant portholes, 30 meters long, 6 meters diameter, was seen on the ground. Figures with helmets covering the head could be seen inside. A sort of haze was observed at both ends of the craft. October 15th, 1954, at night, in Southend, Great Britain, Pat Hennessy ran away when she saw an object land on the road near Chalkwell Park. It had vanished silently when she looked back. On October 15th, 1954, at night, in Ispergues, France, a steel worker observed a luminous sphere land in the countryside. It then emitted lights of various colors. On October 15th, 1954, at night, in Feusse-Nantes, France, truck driver René Leviot saw a flat craft, shaped like an inverted plate, fly very low towards the sea. A second disc followed shortly afterward. Both emitted a red glow. Now going to some strange events in Scotland. In the Grampian region, off Girdle Ness, Aberdeen, crew of collier saw red flashing light which fell into the sea. No wreckage found. 22nd November 1963. In the Highland region, at Loch Mullerdock, near Connacht, mountaineers saw Phantom Cottage, May 1987. At Loch Ness, dwelling place of Lake Monster Nessie, one of several lakes in Scotland with persistent monster reports. Others include Loch Morar, or Morag, Loch Ale, Loch Lochy, Loch Shiel, and also sea lochs like Alsh, Duish, and Lyn. In the Lothian region, in Livingston, a forest worker encountered UFO hovering above ground 9th November 1979. In the Strathclyde region, at Glasgow, man saw a football-sized object hovering above the ground, hissing, glowing red, giving off smell of rotten eggs. It moved towards him, then upstreet, before vanishing. Ball lightning, November 1979. It locked on Isle of Mull, ghostly voice heard in house, summer 1974. In Milngavie, Ball of fire landed on house during thunderstorm. This ball lightning damaged buildings in another in Blantyre, 6 feet in diameter, struck empty petrol tanks, 11th May 1977. In the Western Isles, at Loch Seaforth, steamer crew saw object falling into the sea, no aircraft missing, 27th February 1961. Now in the Solomon Islands, specifically the Santa Cruz Islands, on 3 nights, mysterious flying objects seen, like ball of fire, which flew past below ground level, lighting up the ground. 1 landed, but nothing later found at spot, September 1977.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
Alright, I'm going to continue reading the chapter Voyage into the Supernatural from the book Supernatural by Graham Hancock. In an exhaustive series of 3 national polls conducted by the Roper Organization in 1991, it was established that approximately 1 out of every 5 adult Americans has, at one time or another in their lives, woken up paralyzed with a sense of a strange figure or presence in the room. In addition, nearly 1 adult in 8 has experienced a period of 1 hour or more in which he or she was apparently lost but could not remember why. 1 adult in 10 has felt the experience of actually flying through the air without knowing why or how. 1 adult in 12 has seen unusual lights or balls of light in a room without understanding what was causing them. 1 adult in 12 has discovered puzzling scars on his or her body without remembering how or where they were acquired. The Roper polls, which had been nominally directed at gathering data about unusual personal experiences, were commissioned and the results analyzed by Dr. John Mack, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Dr. David Jacobs, associate professor of history at Temple University, John Carpenter, a psychiatric therapist from Springfield, Missouri, Dr. Ron Westrom, professor of sociology at Eastern Michigan University, and Bud Hopkins, a New York-based author, researcher, and counselor with specialist knowledge of the so-called alien abduction or UFO abduction phenomenon. Indeed, the specific but hidden agenda of the surveys, behind the more innocuously declared interest in unusual personal experiences, was to get some sort of statistical measure of the prevalence in the general population of individuals who had been afflicted by the constellation of extremely unusual personal experiences associated with classic UFO abductions. The belief that one might have been abducted by alien entities in an unidentified flying object is generally taken as a sign of an unbalanced mind in our society and provokes ridicule. The pollster's strategy was therefore to avoid direct questions on this subject and to focus, more obliquely, on experiences known to be associated with UFO abductions. Such experiences, in their turn, had been extracted from thousands of hours of interviews with deeply troubled and perplexed people, conducted, often under hypnosis, by John Mack, John Carpenter, David Jacobs, and Bud Hopkins. The interviewees had all undergone distressing episodes in their lives, often beginning in childhood and continuing into adulthood, that felt real to them, but that seemed objectively impossible. In many cases, they shamefacedly attributed these episodes to abduction by extraterrestrial beings who took them up to spaceships in the sky, or sometimes underwater or underground, and did painful, humiliating, and unpleasant things to them there before returning them to their home environments. More frequently, however, they did not remember exactly what had happened, only that something had happened, but under hypnosis had full recall of repeated abduction by aliens at intervals throughout their lives. Because so many interviewees were unable to remember being abducted until the details were extracted using hypnosis, the questions in the Roper surveys concentrated on the kinds of odd experiences that these individuals had been able to recall prior to hypnosis, often the very experiences that had led them to seek therapy in the first place. The 5 strong indicators listed above, i.e. waking up paralyzed in the night with a strange figure in the room, inexplicably flying, puzzling scars on the body, an hour or more of missing time, seeing balls of light, were reported particularly frequently by UFO abductees. The poll designers therefore decided that if any respondents answered yes to at least 4 out of the 5 indicators, then they would count these individuals as probable abductees. Altogether, 2% of the total survey sample fell into this category. Quote, this suggests that 2% of the adults in the American population have had a constellation of experiences consistent with an abduction history. Therefore, based on our sample of nearly 6,000 respondents, we believe that 1 out of every 50 adult Americans may have had UFO abduction experiences. In 1991, when the Roper polls were conducted, 1 out of every 50 adult Americans was equivalent to almost 4 million people. Before going further, I wish to state very clearly and for the record that when I started to explore the avenue of investigation set out in this and the next 5 chapters, I did not believe that UFOs were nuts and bolts spaceships from other planets. Likewise, I did not believe that the aliens frequently associated with the UFO sightings were physical beings from extraterrestrial civilizations who for some reason visited the Earth, abducted certain specially selected humans, inflicted all manner of strange and intimate procedures on them, and then returned them to their homes, only to abduct the same individuals again and again, often over periods of many years, in order to carry out more strange procedures. In Chapter 3, I described my own direct observations of entities resembling the popular conception of aliens. Entities who appeared to me in hallucinations seen under the influence of ayahuasca. The absolutely convincing and indeed terrifying nature of these hallucinations, which included objects like flying saucers, raised the possibility in my mind that the UFO sightings and alien abductions so widely and sensationally reported all around the world in recent years are likely to be best understood as experiences stemming from altered states of consciousness, rather than nuts and bolts physical encounters of any kind. Now, as I write these words after completing my research, my lack of belief in physical, extraterrestrial explanations for UFOs and aliens, and my intuition that they must be visionary phenomenon, has hardened into something close to a certainty. I give readers fair warning, therefore, that nothing will be found in the pages that follow to support the idea that aliens are visitors from outer space. No one can rule out such a possibility entirely, but the evidence I have gathered suggests they are something far more interesting and far more mysterious than that. There is one particularly unusual, distressing, and distinctive personal experience that people who believe they have been abducted by UFOs report more often and more consistently than almost any other. This is the humiliating and traumatizing experience of being subjected by the abducting entities to forced medical examinations and to painful and incomprehensible surgical procedures that often leave behind permanent visible scars and sometimes even mysterious implants in abductees' bodies. For full details, the reader is referred to the published work of John Mack, David Jacobs, and Thomas Bullard, where hundreds of pages of such reports can be found. Here, a few examples will have to suffice to convey the peculiar character of the overall phenomenon. The high point of Sandy Larson's 1975 UFO abduction was a view of the Earth and space through the end of a luminous tunnel. The low point was an extremely unpleasant experience of bizarre and radical surgery in which beings removed her brain and set it down beside her. In the autumn of 1950, Betty Aho was abducted by humanoids that she described as about 3 feet tall with pear-shaped heads and large unblinking eyes. Dramatic events followed. The UFO plunged into the sea and came out again, then entered huge crystalline caverns which broadened into a vast underworld. Later, Aho was floated onto a table. Quote, "She felt stuck to it while the beings removed her right eye and implanted a tiny device deep within her head using a luminous needle. The being's hand on her forehead relieved her pain. They implanted objects in her spine and heels. The beings passed handheld instruments over her spine and pointed needle-like devices at her head, causing her to feel the implants inside her." Some 40 years later, at the beginning of the 1990s, John Mack's patient Scott recalled that during one of his numerous abduction experiences, he found himself in what he took to be a spaceship, stretched out on a table flanked by 2 doctor-like figures. His head lay on a block, and 4 prongs were being pressed into his neck, high up just below the scalp. Scott believed these were electrodes, Mack reports, quote, "that were used to manipulate and control his movements and feelings." Jerry, another of Mack's patients, remembered an abduction in which she was brought into a large spaceship with a domed roof and then into a circular room within it, which was shiny and metallic looking and contained what looked like equipment. Here, small, dark, human-like beings performed incomprehensible tests on her body under the guidance of a taller, lighter entity who she thought of as male and as the leader. At one point he asked her telepathically, but confusingly, if the medication has been okay up to now. Immediately afterwards, she reported something sharp like a needle was driven from a high angle down into the side of her neck. Quote, "They're turning it! Oh, it's inside of me! They stuck that thing inside of me." Like many other abductees, Catherine's experience, having been brought against her will on board what she believed was a UFO, involved first being taken into a metallic room, like burnished aluminum but darker, and made to lie on a table there. She noted that the room had muted lighting and that a number of small beings were present in it with her. The leader, or examiner, though taller than the others, was nonetheless shorter than Catherine. His skin appeared to be very smooth, whitish gray, and his manner was intimidating. "He's looking at me like you look at a frog before you dissect it." Next, Catherine remembered being subjected to a series of painful gynecological procedures and was convinced that samples had been taken from her ovaries. We will return in Chapter 13 to the possible significance of these, also very common reproductive aspects of the UFO abduction experience. Meanwhile, Catherine's ordeal was far from over. She described a metal instrument maybe a foot long that was inserted perhaps 6 inches into one of her nostrils, i.e. into her brain. Quote, "I could feel something breaking in my head. When he pushed it through, he broke whatever it was and pushed it all the way through, up even further. I'm wondering what they broke. I don't know the anatomy, and he broke something to get through, to get into my brain. I don't know what it was. I want to know if it's going to heal." Joe recalled being abducted by a humanoid with a triangular face and a large forehead, narrow chin, and large black elliptical eyes, that first floated him into a spaceship that was much bigger inside than outside, and then used mind control to make him lie on a table. Here he was suddenly surrounded by 8 to 10 small beings. One, standing to his left, fell upon him with a large needle about a foot long with a kind of hilt. The needle entered the left side of Joe's neck below the ear, against the skull, causing severe pain. Quote, "They're putting a picture in my mind of a small, silver, pill-shaped thing that they're leaving there, which has 4 tiny, tiny wires coming off it. After the needle was removed, Joe reported that he received telepathic messages from the beings. Quote, "We are close. We are with you. We are here to help you. We're here to guide you, to make it through your difficult times." On another occasion, Joe was abducted together with his baby son Mark and witnessed the beings holding crystals against the child's head and shining a light on his eyes and on his hand. John Mack's patient Eva saw a gray spaceship, panicked, blacked out, then found herself on a table in a room with two beings inspecting her. Quote, "I was in a fetal position, my back to them. They were doing something to my spine. My entire spine was stinging and cold. It was awful. It felt as though they were going inside my body with some very sharp instrument and inserting it between my flesh and my skin." Karen also found herself in a room on a spaceship. "They opened up my chest and took my heart out." Similarly, Carlos told Mac of how he had been floated up through the sky on a beam of light to what he took to be a spacecraft. He found himself in the rotunda of this circular vessel, in a spacious, instrument-filled room where many small humanoid creatures were about their business, seemingly with no expectations of him. However, one of them eventually led him to another part of the ship, where he was placed on a table that he described as a block of crystal. Here, a female being with huge oblique eyes, but hardly a nose and hardly a mouth, instructed reptilian-faced, insectile-bodied, or robot-like entities to perform an operation on him. The operation was excruciatingly painful and involved the use of crystals. Quote, "Whatever these crystals are, metal-like more than glass-like, there is light. I can see it. It is like a squared tube of crystal with the sides lopped off, so that at the ends each tube appears eight-sided, and then the end of it is shaped like a step pyramid. It shoots laser light into the body, but it feels like a needle because it hurts, and it resembles a needle." I was already familiar with the sorts of initiatory ordeals that hallucinating shamans the world over believe they suffer at the hands of spirits. The limited extracts from the vast ethnographic literature on this subject that are given in Chapter 10 are sufficient to make it clear that these ordeals frequently and graphically involve procedures that Westerners would very likely construe as medical or surgical in nature. I was satisfied that close and persuasive parallels exist between these often baffling and painful episodes of shamanic surgery on the one hand, and the piercing and spearing of the wounded men figures in Upper Paleolithic cave art on the other. But it was unsettling to discover equally strong parallels in the supposed surgical procedures on board spaceships described under hypnosis by people of the late 20th century who believe that they have been abducted by UFOs. Quote, "Jerry reported something sharp like a needle being driven from a high angle down into the side of her neck. A small being plunged a large needle, with about a foot long, with a kind of hilt into Joe's neck below the ear, against the skull, causing severe pain. A metal instrument, maybe a foot long, was inserted deeply into Catherine's brain through one of her nostrils. He broke something to get it into my brain." Compare the above with these ethnographic accounts of shamans' hallucinatory experiences cited in Chapter 10. Quote, "3 black devils thrust a lance through his head." Yeah, could. "A spirit throws an invisible lance at him, which pierces his neck from behind, passes through his tongue, making therein a large hole, and then comes out through his mouth." Arunta, Australia. "A snake is put in their heads, and their noses are pierced by a magical object." Roramonga, Australia. Returning to the UFO abductees, Betty Aho's right eye was removed, and a tiny device was implanted deep within her head, with additional devices implanted in her spine and heels. Joe believed that a small silver pill-shaped thing with wires coming off it had been implanted in his brain, and witnessed beings holding crystals against his son's head and shining a light on his eyes and on his hand. Crystals were used as surgical instruments in the excruciatingly painful operation that Carlos experienced as part of his UFO abduction. From the shamanic ethnographies, they cut his head open, take out his brains, wash and restore them to give him a clear mind to penetrate the mysteries. They insert gold dust into his eyes. Dayak, Borneo. Then comes a man with a stick. He thrusts the stick into the neophyte's head and puts a magical stone the size of a lemon into the wound. Then the spirits appear to teach him the art of healing. Wotojobaluk, Australia. The Kobeno shaman introduces rock crystals into the novice's head. These eat out his brain and eyes, then take the place of those organs and become his strength. South America. Once they are in the sky, the master inserts into the candidate's body small rainbow serpents and quartz crystals. After this operation, the candidate is brought back to Earth, Forest River, Australia. Back to UFO abductees. 2 beings operated on Ava's spine. It felt as though they were going inside my body with some very sharp instrument and inserting it between my flesh and my skin. A long needle was inserted into Betty Hill's navel, causing her agonizing pain. Back to the shamanic ethnographies. I saw the form of a man whose head was surrounded by a bright glow. He spoke, "Wait without fear until I have said and done everything that I intend." Then I felt various instruments, first like sharp knives, then like needles, penetrate my flesh. Ojibwa, North America. The aspirant to the Kuksu Society is believed to have his navel pierced with a lance and an arrow by Kuksu himself, River Patwin, North America. After Sandra Larson had been taken aboard a UFO, she had a memorable and most unusual experience. Beings removed her brain and set it down beside her. But even here, hallucinatory initiations offer striking parallels. For example, in the case of a Yakut shaman cited by Iliad, the spirits cut off his head, which they set aside. I found other remarkable parallels, not all of which there is space to list here, between these medical aspects of the abduction phenomenon and the descriptions of spiritual surgery that feature so frequently and prominently in ethnographies. One that is particularly striking, because so odd, concerns the ritual of the counting of the bones, which is reported from many different shamanic cultures. A typical case is that of a Tungus shaman who entered a deep trance, during which he experienced a ritual of initiation at the hands of spiritual beings. Quote, they pierced him with arrows, and he lost consciousness and fell to the ground. They cut off his flesh, tore out his bones, and counted them. If one had been missing, he could not have become a shaman. In another Siberian account, the shaman Kazlezov told how he had been cut into pieces on a black table by 2 black and 2 fair beings, who counted his bones on the orders of their chieftain. Quote, they found a bone around the ribs which had a hole in the middle. This was the excess bone. This brought about my becoming a shaman, because only those men can become shamans in whose body such a bone can be found. It seemed most unlikely that there would be anything like this in the UFO abduction literature, but I soon discovered that there was. David Jacobs of Temple University, who has conducted extensive interviews with hundreds of abductees, and himself completely rejects any connection between their experiences and those of shamans, nevertheless notes that they frequently make reference to the prodding and palpation of their bones and joints. Quote, the small beings look closely at the subject's ribs and rib cage. Sometimes they make a small incision on the abductee's left side. They methodically touch and press each individual vertebrae from the neck to the coccyx. They take a long time with the vertebrae as their fingers manipulate each bone structure. Likewise, John Mack's patient Catherine, whom we met earlier, described an experience in which small beings with huge black almond eyes floated her up to an enormous silver metallic UFO and then into one of its cavernous rooms, the size of an airplane hangar. As her captors led her through the room, she noticed rows of tables on either side. Some of these were empty, but on others she saw procedures being done in what she estimated were between 100 and 200 humans. Catherine was forced to sit on one of the tables, and then the following explicitly bone-counting experience unfolded. Quote, they're running their little fingers down my spine like they're counting the vertebra in my spinal column. What the hell's that for? To make sure everything's okay, he says. My curiosity had been aroused, but my initial reaction to what looked like a series of remarkable, unexplained cross-cultural commonalities was one of skepticism. I simply could see no reason why hunter-gatherer shamans who deal with spirits and make rain should have anything in common with sophisticated American city dwellers who happen to believe that they've been abducted by aliens. So I worked hard to downplay the similarities I was seeing and to persuade myself that they must all result from coincidence. As other such coincidences began to pile up, however, I became increasingly perplexed at the level of detail. Why should spirits in one part of the world and at one period of history, and aliens in another part of the world at another period of history, both abduct men and women, insert mysterious objects in their heads, stick lances or massive needles into their necks and skulls, and plant crystals into their bodies, count their bones, take out their eyes and brains, etc., etc.? On reflection, I could see how ludicrous it was to imagine that people from such different cultural backgrounds as shamans and UFO abductees could have independently invented what were essentially the same utterly bizarre entities and the same utterly inexplicable medical surgical procedures. What if that wasn't what was going on here, then what was? I had the sense that I had stumbled on the outline of an underlying pattern deeply buried and of troublesome things waiting to come to light.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
I'm going to read an extended excerpt from Breaking Open the Head by Daniel Pinchbeck, and it's prefaced by an introduction by Richard Metzger. When I was 12 years old and in the 7th grade, I bought a used paperback copy of Aldous Huxley's psychedelic classic, The Doors of Perception. Looking back on it, the only reason I can think of that led me to buy it must have been the Doors connection. I knew that Jim Morrison took the band's name from Huxley's Slim volume, and it must have cost me all of 50 cents, so I picked it up. It wasn't that I liked the Doors or anything, I didn't like them much at all, but I was really curious about drugs at that age. Something about this mysterious book seemed to beckon me to take it home, so I did, along with a huge stack of comic books, I'm quite sure. I read the entire book one morning sitting in church with my parents and grandparents, who of course had no idea what I was reading. I often chose books to read in church that allowed me to silently rebel against the odious weekly ritual I hated so much, so the subject matter and the meager page count made it a perfect Sunday book for me. I remember being astonished at what I was reading and made it a point to immediately, if not sooner, get my hands on some LSD, something that took me about 2 more years to actually acquire, but when I did, it certainly didn't disappoint. Since that time I have returned again and again to to the fountains of Huxley's gratuitous grace during times of crisis or confusion in my life, and I have benefited greatly from the inner journeys and clarity provided by LSD, magic mushrooms, and later, the sci-fi dimensions of the DMT flash. I try to make it a point to take a high dose of mushrooms at least once a year, if for no other reason, to blow all the bad shit out of my brain. The publication of Daniel Pinchbeck's book Breaking Open the Head, by Broadway Books, was, to my mind, nothing short of an event. Pinchbeck, co-founder and co-editor, with novelist Thomas Beller, of the highbrow literary magazine Open City, has come up with something I had despaired of seeing again after the untimely death of Terence McKenna, an instant classic of drug literature, and just in time. This generation badly needed its own doors of perception, and Breaking Open the Head is it, having arrived not a moment too soon. In a way, Breaking Open the Head is almost 2 books in one. On one hand, a historical overview of how psychedelics, or entheogens, in the politically correct tripper parlance, made their way into the diet of middle-class American students, ushering in the age of Aquarius, hippie, in opposition to an unpopular and misguided war, and on the other, a travelogue and marvelously candid account of Pinchbeck's shamanic vision quest to break open his own head. What's particularly endearing about the book is that Pinchbeck himself is such a wonderful tour guide. Feeling alienated and depressed after the death of his father, abstract expressionist painter Peter Pinchbeck, his mother is writer Joyce Johnson, author of Minor Characters and at one time the girlfriend of Jack Kerouac. Pinchbeck became desperate to somehow lift himself out of the Sartrean nausea and disconnectedness he felt himself sinking into in his pursuit of a literary career in his native Manhattan. The book chronicles Pinchbeck's journey from an atheist New York journalist to, as he puts it, a shamanic initiate and grateful citizen of the cosmos. At times I couldn't help but to picture George Plimpton, one of the original participatory journalists, in Daniel's place, and this illustrates one of the book's greatest strengths for the reader. In many ways, Pinchbeck seems an unlikely candidate for spiritual enlightenment. As he describes himself at the start of the book, he's very much an old-school kind of writer, a drinker and a bit of a womanizer, more Hemingway than Huxley, before a series of marvelously etched and often humorous encounters with Amazon witch doctors, shaman, and the blissed-out inhabitants of the Burning Man Festival urged Pinchbeck on to a deeper and deeper understanding, not just of himself, also the weird historical moment we find ourselves in as we approach 10 minutes to midnight on the apocalypse clock. About halfway through the narrative, I began to lament that Pinchbeck seemed to be missing out on the occult, as opposed to the spiritual, aspects of the psychedelic experience. But at that point, a startlingly magical context, and one I personally wholeheartedly endorse, begins to emerge as he asks himself, and the reader, some very important questions. If these dimensions can be accessed by the judicious application of plant and chemical agents, and if the bizarrely alien entities one encounters there are real and autonomous beings, and not just a drug-addled figment of our imaginations, then surely this is big news, isn't it? Big fucking news, people. Big fucking news. But what does this mean? Why aren't our finest minds working on getting to the bottom of this? One of the greatest mysteries facing us as human beings. Why instead are we turning away from wisdom and towards self-annihilation, war, and planetary suicide? It doesn't make any damned sense. Could the widespread emergence of psychedelics in Western culture be any accident? 50 years ago, psychedelics were practically unheard of outside of botanical or beatnik circles. Today, an historical blink of the eye since, due to the pioneering public relations efforts of Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, and others, millions of people have experienced the enlightenment of the psychedelic experience. No, this was no accident. It's all part of a strange and wondrous process that is unfolding in our lifetimes, and Breaking Open the Head is a part of that process and carries on in that tradition. The enlightenment and gnosis resulting from the use of visionary plants and neurochemicals may be mankind's only hope for survival. In an interesting interview that appeared in the Arthur newspaper, Pinchbeck argues that this is the task of the counterculture in our time. Quote, "This goal is the direct legacy of the counterculture, but it is actually hundreds, if not many thousands of years older than that. In fact, this is the mission that we must somehow accomplish. Think of it as a secret raid to be carried out behind enemy lines, despite incredible odds and with no possibility of failure. The Beats and hippies saw through the abrasive insanity gnawing at the soul of America, this warmongering, money-mad, climate-destroying monstrosity which is now casting a dreadful shadow across this planet. Where the Beats acted intuitively, from the heart, we now have the necessary knowledge to put together a new paradigm that is simultaneously political, ecological, spiritual, and far more accurate than the outdated Newtonian Darwinian model which is propping up the status quo." End quote. Breaking Open the Head is a serious, thoughtful, provocative, and brave book that should be read by everyone who senses that breaking open his or her own head might be the sanest act to perform in today's world. I urge you all to read it. Richard Metzger. I met David Palenque. He had started a company selling experimental research chemicals which were labeled not for human consumption, although most of them could be found in the back pages of Sasha Shulgin's books. Sitting by the pool one day, I heard Dave tell how he had studied to be a priest but dropped out to become a professional masseuse. By some circuitous route, a typical tangled American odyssey, he made his way from the Miami Beach yacht scene to psychedelics and the cutting edge of mind expansion. On Palenque, Dave invited me to join his private research group, giving me free and low-priced introductions to some new chemicals, as well as his regular catalog of little-known and unscheduled compounds. Fearing intensified government surveillance, he abruptly closed his company the day after September 11th, even though his business did not seem to be violating any specific laws. Back in New York, I ordered a few things from his catalog. They came to my home in plain envelopes labeled with intimidating chemical names. For $125, I bought 1 gram of yellowish powder of something called DPT, dipropyltryptamine, which has a chemical resemblance to DMT. As far as I can ascertain, DPT, unlike DMT, does not occur in nature, which means it did not exist until some modern alchemist synthesized it in a laboratory a few decades ago. While DMT, an endogenous chemical inside the body, is recognized by MAO enzymes and immediately neutralized, DPT, a new concoction, is not. Therefore, it crosses the blood-brain barrier through direct sniffing or swallowing. But the most interesting aspect of the two chemicals is that the worlds they reveal are completely different. Why should this be the case? I don't know. I only know that propyl and methyl are simple carbon compounds, 2 of the building blocks of organic matter. There is, for example, methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, and propyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol. The tryptamine molecule is the building block of many neurotransmitters, and of many psychoactive compounds. Serotonin is a tryptamine. In Shulgin's book and on the internet, I found some write-ups about DPT trips. Some describe the effects as terrifying, quote, "The whole universe falls apart, all colors and electric air whirlpool into a mandala, eating up forever. That's it, the world's over." Others felt after smoking the drug, they entered for the first time the clear light of God. Another report was more narrative. Quote, "I was being led by a wise old man who I know was God. I was handed a Torah for me to carry as a sign that I had been accepted and forgiven and come home." Shulgin also mentioned a church in New York, Temple of the True Inner Light, which uses DPT as its sacrament. Clearly DPT was a mind warper of heavyweight proportions. I put the slim envelope of white powder in the refrigerator where it sat for a few months. I am often caught between my desire for new and intense altered states and my extreme fear of them. I fear them because every major doorway that I go through changes me in an ineffable but permanent way. I think this is the case for anyone with any sensitivity. After your first serious LSD trip, you really are never quite the same person again. You have been given another perspective on yourself and your ego. You have been permanently relativized. The same with DMT or ayahuasca. You may spend the rest of your life suppressing the memory, but somewhere inside of you, it is there. As Don Juan told Castaneda, we are men, and our lot is to learn and to be hurled into inconceivable new worlds. Psychedelics are catalysts for evolution and transformation, and when you take them, you have to be ready to transform in unexpected ways. That is the beauty and the power of them. That is why they need to be treated with utmost respect. That is also why it is good to be scientifically precise about what chemical you are taking, to know, as best as you can, what that chemical will do to you and why you are taking it. Because I didn't know exactly what DPT was or what I wanted from it, I bought it and then sheepishly left it alone. My cautious resistance to the DPT lure continued until one night after a party. For the first time in several months I was drunk. I was with my 2 oldest friends, twin brothers, who were suddenly eager to try the DPT in my fridge. We each snorted a line, and for me it was an interesting disaster. I was both drunk and tripping. On the one hand, the world was a woozy mess. On the other hand, I was seeing it with razor-edged precision and in the most vibrant colors. When I closed my eyes, I saw multicolored 3-dimensional triangles rotating in black space. I realized later that I had foolishly used alcohol to overcome my fear of DPT, the way I used to drink for the courage to talk to girls at bars. I didn't like DPT. Something about the DPT realm seemed icy and annihilating to me. I told my friends over and over again, this is evil, DPT is bad, this is not something we should explore, this is not a good doorway. In retrospect, I don't think that I was exploring the DPT realm on that trip. I think instead the DPT realm was beginning its exploration of me. Because this is a story, not just about chemicals, but also about occult correspondences and psychic events, I will note that later that night, we went out to a bar and started talking to the people next to us. For some reason, I talked about my anxiety over 2012, the Hopi and Mayan prophecies. One of them described a vivid dream she had when she was a teenager that had stayed with her ever since. I was living in a kind of spaceship full of people. We were lifting off from Earth. I looked back at the Earth and there was brown crust where the land had been. We shot into space and went a long way. When an angel appeared to us, he said that God had decided to rejuvenate the Earth even though he had ruined it. He's going to start again, to do it all over from scratch. For the time being, we were going to have to wait in limbo. And he pointed to a vast gray space where many people were already waiting. We had to leave the spaceship to go there. It was another few months before I tried DPT again. In the meantime, another new friend from Palenque accepted my invitation and came to New York. This was Charity the Fire Dancer. 24 years old, skilled at tarot and ceremonial magic, a professional stripper, she was the fearless and pixie-like embodiment of the new culture I had found at Burning Man. In Mexico, I told her I could find her a free place to stay in New York, and she hitchhiked all the way from Palenque with her cat, Prometheus, catching rides from truckers at truck stops. Unlike me, Charity had no fear of new psychedelics. She kept a list of all the drugs she had tried, and the number was up to 43. I told her I had this DPT stuff around, and of course she wanted to try it. Charity and I took DPT at my house one night, once again. I had overcome an intense initial reluctance. Finally, I put some of the yellowish powder into a pill and swallowed it, but got no effect. She sniffed a line and almost instantly went into a trance. When her trip was over, she told me I had to try sniffing it. Sometimes when one trips, it seems that all of the psychic matter, whether spoken or not, swirling around in the hours and days beforehand, gathers together, like particles galvanized by a magnet, and pushes the journey in a certain direction. These influences can seem like the karmic trance of some larger pattern. On many levels, what seems to operate is a specific intentionality. Earlier that night, Charity had told me about the psychic vampires who roamed the streets of San Francisco, some of them homeless hippies who would pick up vibrations from strangers, talk to them, and suck their energy away. I laughed at this. We also talked about the books of Zecharia Sitchin, whose scholarly research convinced him that a race of extraterrestrial giants had created human beings long ago to serve them as slaves, a variation on the concept of the archons from Gnosticism. According to Sitchin, the beauty and sophistication of the cruel alien race that created us was beyond our imagining. Charity cut 2 big lines of the DPT on the table, and I snorted one. The powder burned my nasal passages. Bitter residue dripped down the back of my throat. I stretched out on the couch. In a minute or two, I closed my eyes and entered the DPT realm. We were listening to moody techno music. With each change in beat, with each skitter of electrical noise, I saw a brand new and extremely detailed demonic universe swirl before me in cobalt, scarlet, purple gossamer hues. At moments there seemed to be some incredibly elegant yet violently orgiastic party taking place with beautiful females in evening gowns and men in Edwardian topcoats in the spacious parlors of a huge and opulent mansion. At other times there seemed to be bat or butterfly-winged creatures, long and quivering antennas, velvet coats and emerald eyes, stiletto talons, rising into otherworldly skies, wandering futuristic cities. I had an impression of tremendous vanity. I was being used as a mirror for the DPT beings to admire themselves. But their realm was beyond what can be expressed in ordinary language in its speed of transmutation, its shivering quicksilver beauty. The worlds revealed were like endless facets of a twirling diamond. I felt the real possibility of being trapped inside any of those facets, a kind of soul prison for eternity. That was the terror of it, as was smoking salvia. I had the sense that some part of me had always been stuck in this gothic DPT prison, trapped there eternally. I somehow understood that this was not my first visit nor my last. For a flicker of forever, I was imprisoned in a postmodern bar surrounded by gleaming mirrors with a hyper-slick lounge lizard wearing a white mohawk and synthetic fabrics. He was sitting at the bar drinking a highball. There were no doors or windows in this room, no escape possible. The graphics of this vision were high-res and hyper-perfect. Other shards of the DPT realm shared this sci-fi quality. DPT was a postmodern demonic MTV psychedelic. The sleek, rhythmical mesh of the music seemed woven into the lurid fabric of the darkness, the revelation of sinister forces coming to life behind my eyelids. Like DMT, the level of visual organization of the DPT realm seemed far beyond anything that the synaptical wiring of my brain could create. It was, in its own peacock feathery way, not just as real as this reality, but far more real, crackling with power. I felt from the entities exploring my mind a kind of contempt, a disdain for human beings trapped in our pitiful, unsophisticated domain, our meat realm. They seemed somewhere between bemused and enraged. In shamanic cultures, the taking of entheogenic substances is always surrounded by ritual. A circle of protection is created, the 4 directions invoked, the spirits ask for their blessing through an offering of tobacco and prayer. Because we were sniffing a chemical powder in a modern New York apartment, a chemical without a long history of human use, it didn't even occur to us to take such precautions. I was jealous of Charity because she managed to get to the kitchen sink and throw up. She vomited 4 or 5 times in a row. Later, she said she saw a male entity in the sink, with a kind of device or machine that he was using to soak up the energy she was expulsing, jeering at her as he did it. The demon told her his name, but she couldn't recall it. I couldn't throw up. I suspected that I had finally and completely managed to destroy myself. I was convinced I would never recover from this onslaught. I staggered to the CD player and changed the music to Bach, which helped a little. With my eyes open, transformational energy seemed to be crawling over everything, flickering and receding like waves of sentient power, vampiric electricity. My hands looked and felt like claws made out of wires. When I opened my eyes on ayahuasca, I also felt and saw energy passing like a waveform, but it was more human somehow. Here the speed of the waves was much faster and more brutal than the Yage flares. The experience was unmammalian, futuristic, and human. Not only was it suddenly obvious that there was such a thing as a soul, it was also clear that I was in danger of losing mine permanently. I somehow understood that the DPT realm had evolved over an incredibly long period, millions of years, if time had the same kind of meaning to them as it does to us. I realized there were occult hierarchies, secret cabals, treasuries of wickedness to be studied over millennia. It was obvious that we little human beings have absolutely no idea what is going on in the cosmos. The word Baroque doesn't even begin to describe the jaded emptiness and sublime beauty of that other country. A little bit like soft candle flicker worlds you see on a hash and opium, but etched in perfect solid-state reality. More than photographic. The sleekness of the DPT dimension was beyond belief. About half an hour into the trip, past 3 a.m., I called my friend Tony. "This is total magic, total sorcery. I'm watching endless gothic demon universes mirroring each other," I babbled to him. "If somebody could be at home here, learn to control things here, they could gain so much fucking power, they could just walk right through the walls of the White House, do anything, but it wouldn't matter, because they'd already be part of such an ancient conspiracy." I had begun to pace around the house, and as I paced, I found that I was moving my arms in the air, making passes like the shamanic gestures described in Castaneda's work. These gestures came to me intuitively. They seemed to help control the overwhelming sense of assault. "Daniel, don't be taken in by it, it's just samsara," Tony said. His voice was a soothing lifeline. He laughed at me. He tried to convince me that the trip would end soon, that I wasn't permanently fried. He told me I should have known what I was doing, since I had called DPT evil after my first attempt. "What's that music you're playing in the background?" he asked. "Bach," I told him. "It's the only thing that's keeping me together. Perhaps that's why they are here. The demons are attracted to the music. They are crowding in here to be close to it." "Well, that's nice," he said. "There's nothing nice about that," I screeched at him. "They are totally defiant. They don't give a shit about us. We are their puppets." But at this point, the trip was starting to wind down. In a few minutes, Charity and I were back in reality once again, whatever that figment might be. I felt incredibly relieved. "Wow, I can't believe it," I said to Tony. "Reality. This is definitely a good thing." In the next few days, however, I learned that I wasn't quite back in reality after all, or if I was, it was a new, hypercharged one. I was supposed to leave to meet my girlfriend in Berlin the next day. In the morning, my travel agent came up with a cheap last-minute ticket. On the plane, I sat next to a German woman dressed in elegant black. I was reading The Invisible Landscape by Terence and Dennis McKenna, and I noticed she seemed startled after she read a few words from the back cover over my shoulder. She had read the word shamanism. Halfway through the flight, she told me she had been having a series of dreams over the past month in which 2 American Indians, a couple, came into her house and told her that she was meant to be a shaman, that she wasn't supposed to get married. She was meant to devote herself to shamanism totally. The dreams mystified her. She had never thought about shamanism and she had no idea what it was. "Do you know anything about it?" she asked. I tried to explain the basics of shamanism and gave her the names of some books to read. Also, I told her what I believed, what I had learned from Robert. Quote, "The Indian cultures have been almost wiped out, but shamanism is an essential human phenomenon connected to the earth. Right now, the shamans of the past are looking for candidates who can carry on the traditions. They have zeroed in on you as a possible candidate. You can choose to follow this or ignore it, but I definitely recommend that you learn more about it before making a decision." The woman had a tribal pendant around her neck. On it was a pattern of lightning-like zigzags around a central circle. I asked her about it. "Somebody gave this to me on a beach in Mexico," she said. "They said it was a Navajo protection symbol, but I had an intuitive, uncanny sense that this symbol had been sent to me, to show me that I was being protected, somehow, that I was being taken through a process. Even though I was freaking out, I had to trust that the process was good. In shamanic cultures, synchronicities are recognized as signs that you are on the right path. I was in Berlin because Laura's father had been stricken with cancer. The entire family was assembling for the weekend. Because Laura was pregnant and wouldn't be able to travel later, she was staying with her parents for several weeks. Whenever I was left alone, I found myself walking around the house and making conducting gestures again. I was afraid I was becoming some sort of obsessive-compulsive, but I could control the gestures when other people were around. One night I couldn't sleep. With my eyes closed, I watched vivid imagery unfold in little film loops. I saw a huge column of fire shooting up from the center of Stonehenge. I envisioned myself walking into the flame column, being obliterated and shooting up into space. Then I saw the surface of another planet, covered in coral and sponge-like growths. A smirking alien was standing next to one of the sponges, and he kept flowing through the organic folds of the plant, then reassembling himself. He and the plant were fused in magical symbiosis. Finally, I fell asleep. The next night, I had 2 extremely vivid dreams in which I was pursued by a bearded man. In one dream, I threw a party in an apartment where I once lived. Aggressive strangers showed up and stole my books from the shelves. A bearded man came up to me. "I used to live here," he said. "Do you want to come back?" I asked. "Yes," he said. Back in New York, I still felt very strange. Fizzy and non-ordinary, with a buzzing around my temples. It was my second night at home and I was jet-lagged. 10 minutes after I turned out the lights and got into bed, a large mirror in the other room fell off the wall and loudly crashed face down on the floor. It didn't break. All night I dreamt that the bearded man was hitting me in the head with a pillow over and over again and laughing as he did it. I tried to hit him back, but my swings were feeble misses. When I awoke in the morning feeling groggy, I went to get a yogurt from the refrigerator. I opened the tightly closed silverware drawer and reached for a spoon. Right under the spoons was a large and ominous bug. It did not look like a New York bug at all. It was winged, honey brown, with a long curly tail, and it quickly wriggled out of sight. I screamed and slammed the drawer shut. Fuck, I thought. The DPT trip had unleashed an angry poltergeist in my house. How could this be? I've never had a belief or even the slightest interest in poltergeists or the occult. But the signs couldn't be much more obvious. Suddenly I was in the midst of something for which I had no frame of reference, no preparation. What had I done? Once again, as often before, I cursed myself for my fascination with these chemicals. I walked around in a panic. I went to the East Village and sat at a cafe. On the way, I stopped in a Tibetan Buddhist store. I asked the clerk if he had any symbols of protection, and he sold me a small metal dorji, a Tibetan lightning bolt symbol used in meditation. I still felt fizzy. I had a tingling around my left temple, and my left hand was buzzing slightly. Clutching the dorji in my fist, I called Charity and told her about the situation. "Oh man," she said, "we've got to clean that thing out of there before your girlfriend comes back with the baby." It turned out that Charity, from her days of San Francisco witchcraft, modern paganism was another scene I always dismissed, knew all about exorcisms and entities. She had carted with her all the way from Mexico an entire kit bag of magical implements, including a large and beautifully smooth obsidian ball that somebody gave her in Palenque and some quartz crystals. While I knew that quartz was used for shamanic healing to realign energy patterns, I did not know that obsidian was considered to have the power of absorption of negative spiritual energies. "This ball is so excellent, it just sucks all that stuff right up," Charity said. She also brought ceremonial candle holders, tacky little sculptures of a cat and an elephant, which became Boss and Ganesh for the duration of the ceremony, and Aleister Crowley's elegant tarot cards. I met her, and we went back to the apartment. "I can already feel it," she said when we were in the lobby, and it was true. The air in the building seemed electrically charged, more so in the elevator, and in the apartment, the charge was almost a physical presence. Charity put the obsidian ball down on the ground in the center of the living room. We both watched, astonished, as it took the ball an extremely long time to stop trembling, finally rotating in smaller and smaller circles until it stopped. She organized a rather quick magical ritual, consulting the tarot cards several times. I had also never given tarot cards much thought, but now I was watching them as if my life depended on it. I felt in some obscure and woozy way, perhaps it did. She picked a card with lightning bolts all over it. Swiftness. "So we'll be swift," she said. She picked fortune, suggesting a change for the better. She picked futility. My heart sank. But opposite it, the Queen of Cups. My court card. "Because your card is a water sign, we've got to do something with water," she said, quickly analyzing the situation like a technician faced with an engineering problem. She soaked the obsidian ball in salt water, then held it in the toilet and flushed a few times. "Take that bullshit out of here," she commanded. At the end of the ritual, the atmosphere in the apartment seemed changed, cleared out. It was, we thought, safe again. It was safe until later that night when I returned from visiting Tony. Once again, I felt the apartment crackling with a static occult buzz. My temple and left hand started buzzing weirdly. I had been jokingly complaining to Tony about the supernatural forces taking such obvious manifestations, a falling mirror, a big bug. It was all so silly, so comic book-like even, flirtatious. Once again, the joke seemed to be on me as I lay in bed and felt increasingly creeped out and panicked. I went into the living room and sat in front of the obsidian ball. I picked up the dorje and chanted a bit, nonsense words, Asiatic sounding, insectile, similar to what I recalled with the Sequoia language, came into my head and I called them out. "Ching, ching! Gotta ching! Gotta ching!" I wrapped the hard surface of the black ball with the Vajra. Then I held the Vajra in my palms before the ball and looked straight at the ball. In a few seconds, my entire visual field turned gray. All I could see were a few rectangles of refracted light in the center of the ball. Thick grayness covered everything else. I turned away from the ball and looked around the room. In 2 seconds, my vision went back to normal. I looked back at the ball. My entire visual field turned gray yet again. I grabbed my jacket and ran out of the house. Once in the street, I called my friend Michael. Michael is 20 years older than me, a poet and novelist with an impressive knowledge of alternative healing in indigenous cultures. He first told me about ayahuasca. For an hour, as I paced around the streets of downtown New York, Michael tried to calm me down. He told me some Buddhist meditation techniques to get you back in your body. He told me that even if there were some other out there, and he was not convinced there was, I had to recognize that aspects of my mind had manifested all of this stuff. It takes two to tango, Michael said. Rather than fighting against it, I could accept it, integrate it within myself. Michael told me to imagine a Buddha hovering over me, shooting pure white light through my body, turning me into blinding white light, flushing everything negative or bad into my central channel, where it would go into my intestines, and ultimately come out of me as shit. At the end of the meditation, Michael told me to imagine this Buddha coming down to me as I merged with the white light. I followed his instructions, and it seemed to help. Soon I fell asleep. By the next morning, the world had returned to some semblance of normal. Perhaps this story seems ridiculous, yet the psychic reality of the DPT encounter and its aftermath overwhelmed most ordinary events. I offer it as a cautionary tale. There are aspects of it that remain, for various reasons, impossible to tell. Suffice it to say that, after DPT, I suspect death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person. There are far worse fates. I'll continue reading the rest of this in the next episode.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real. Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.